Professors Purby and Sutherland Addy are two of Ghana's leading academics on slavery.
A few times when the governors found the ladies were pregnant, they didn't let them go on the ship. They set them free. And it is claimed in oral tradition that there are several settlements around some of the castles where they are of that kind of descent. But you have to be very careful when you want to interview and find out a bit more whether they are of slave descent because their forebears were European men.
Professor Sutherland Addy emphasises that resistance by female captives was not unusual.
When you look at resistances, for example, you had epics, which is very rare, epics to women who would rather die than be taken as slaves in that manner. There was a particular epic where women just put themselves in their big meeting room and set fire to themselves, but they left one woman out to be the one to sing the song, to tell the story. It's such a moving epic, really, really moving, but you could tell that, people were taking a decision, this is it. I mean, we're not taking this, So those for me were untold stories.
There are few first-hand written accounts by captives taken from Africa itself. For instance, by Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who was captured in 1731 when he was making a visit by the River Gambia. Diallo was sent to the English colony of Maryland in North America. Luckily for him, his owner realised his noble origins and released him. Diallo returned to Africa via London, where his portrait was painted. He died in Senegambia in 1773. But perhaps the most compelling narrative is by Olaudah Equiano. He was born in 1745 in Igbo land in what would today be Nigeria. He was snatched as a young boy and at first worked as a slave in Africa. But then he was sold to Europeans and ended up in London, where in 1789 he wrote his memoirs called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. This is one description by him of being on board a slave ship.
I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I have never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horrors almost inconceivable.
Nigerian academic Iwu Ikwebuzo, who is himself Igbo, says Equiano's book is an important historic document.
That book was published in 1789. So in it, he recorded what he could remember about the book because he was kidnapped and sold into slavery at the age of 12. Just like a typical Igbo man, he was very dogged, hard-working. By dint of hard work, he got educated and got his freedom and got engaged in the fight against the slave trade because he was himself a victim of slave trade. So he was fighting against the fight. He wanted to come to Africa, but he was not allowed. When we talk about the history of the Igbo, it's one of the sources. So what he documented in his autobiography provides a lot of information about the Igbo. You cannot talk about Igbo history today without mentioning Olaudah Equiano and his work.
Olaudah Equiano was one individual amongst millions like him exported as a slave from Africa. According to UNESCO's General History of Africa, on which this series bases its facts, the total number of enslaved Africans taken across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries is 12.5 million. Olaudah Equiano became a prominent abolitionist. and by the time of his death in London in 1797, calls for abolition were gaining momentum on both sides of the Atlantic in Europe and the Americas. It was a very public debate, as these illustrations in British publications from the 1790s show. These images seemingly trivialize true accounts of how slaves were tortured. In this caricature, a slave described as work-shy is put in a tub of scalding water. This picture depicts a world in which the black man would have the whip hand over the white race if the abolitionists won the argument. The advocates for abolition argued that if there were no buyers, then the transatlantic slave trade would immediately cease to exist, whereas the slavers insisted that it was the regular supply of slaves from Africa that sustained the external demand for them. And so, according to this argument, the Africans themselves were to blame for the persistence of the slave trade.
If you say that it apportions the blame to the Africans, then my question would be, what portion do you attribute to the Europeans who opened the forts along the African coast? Those forts, basically, they not only stole gold, diamonds, and ivory, they were there to acquire enslaved Africans. So the notion that somehow that there was this reservoir of Africans waiting to be shipped doesn't even water, because there was a demand in the world.
Professor Ezra Allen also says there were economic reasons behind abolition as nations began to industrialize.
There was a transition from mercantile capitalism to industrial capitalism. And for the industrial capitalism to succeed, there was a need for raw material. Amongst the raw material was palm oil, produced from the oil palm tree. Palm oil was shipped to Europe. It was used as lubricant for the industrial machines. Since the tropical materials could be acquired in West Africa, the argument was that keep the slave labor in West Africa. That's one major origin of the abolition. A second origin could be humanitarianism. The emergent notions about democracy, inalienable rights, those combined with some religious sects who began to emphasize that God created all men equally. Now, the debate as to which one of these factors is paramount will continue, but there's a strong consensus that economic motive did help to propel the idea for the abolition of slavery.
So would it be fair to say that humanitarian moral considerations were important, but that wouldn't have been sufficient to see an abolition of the slave trade if there wasn't such a powerful economic imperative?
That's the argument that some historians have made, that the economic motive may have been more powerful, may have been paramount, because let's not forget, the very nations that have been involved, the leaders in the slave trade, Britain, the United States, and other nations, they are the ones now who are making the transition to industrial capitalism, and the need for lubricant to keep the machines running was so important that it decided to end the slave trade and produce the tropical raw material in Africa, ship it to Europe.
Another leading academic in Liberia, Dr. Carl Patrick Burrows, explains that momentum towards abolition was also hastened by regular slave revolts.
Efforts at abolition began with the very beginning of the trade in enslaved Africans. Africans would overpower the crew on various slave ships and direct the ships back to the coast, or in some cases the ships would perish with the enslaved Africans on them.
And there was one rebellion that had a huge impact. A successful slave revolt in Haiti emboldened Africans across the Caribbean and the Americas to resist their enslavement. In 1791 in Haiti, slaves under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a free man with military experience, revolted against their French slave owners.
I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man.
Although Toussaint Louverture did not live to see it, Haiti became an independent republic in 1804.
One of the few instances where a slave rebellion resulted in complete emancipation of a society. And it just reflected the human impulse towards freedom. And the Haitian experience was catalytic in many ways. It reverberated across the United States and Latin America. In North America, there were a number of rebellions by slaves inspired by the example of Haiti.
Legislation abolishing the slave trade was enacted first by Denmark in 1803, Britain in 1807, the United States in 1808, the Netherlands in 1814, France in 1818, and Portugal as late as 1878. However, slavery itself did not end with abolition of the trade, for instance, continuing until 1865 in the south of the United States, and various forms of slavery and forced labor were practiced by Europeans for many decades to come. But after the trade was made illegal, what to do with large numbers of freed Africans? Well, some liberated slaves were sent from North America and Europe back to West Africa to Sierra Leone. This had been founded by the anti-slavery movement in 1788 as a philanthropic settlement for freed Africans.
That impulse reflected deep, long-term attractions on the part of people of African descent to the continent. Their desire, if you will, to return to the continent in one form or the other. In some instances, it was limited to preserving certain cultural manifestations of the customs in Africa. But in other cases, people actively sought to come back. What made Freetown different was...
The capital of Sierra Leone.
The capital of Sierra Leone. What made that different was the fact that you had powerful British interests who allied with the people of African descent who wanted to return and provided the resources.
In 1802, Sierra Leone was taken over by Britain as a colony, and one of its most famous residents was Samuel Adjaye Crowther. He was captured in what is today Nigeria in 1821. Sold into slavery, he was freed by a British naval squadron ship and sent to Freetown. He later returned to Lagos, where he became Bishop of Nigeria. After the break, we see how Liberia was also established as a colony for emancipated slaves. And we find out what the transatlantic slave trade means for Africans today.